Hey folks, and welcome. This is the Affliction Warlock guide, except a little bit different. We're future-proofing it for what we know, at least, of the future patch coming at the end of January in 10.5 or 10.0.5, however you want to think of it. So this video is actually going to be split into two parts. You're going to have the expansion release, or patch 10.0, and then we're going to have 10.5 on the PTR, where I discuss a couple of affliction changes. The changes for the PTR are more AoE focused because we get a couple of extra talents and the path will look the same for the most part, but will have a few talent differences, and I'll actually be talking more about how those talents affect Affliction single target and what that potentially means going forward, while also kind of discussing Affliction's place at the moment and its strengths and its weaknesses. So if you're looking for a gearing guide or you want class talents, please do look at my other two videos. We are going to look at the actual spec talents themselves, briefly touch on trinkets due to damage profiles and how that kind of works, and then we will be going into the rest of the video. So with that in mind then, let's get into the talents at 10.0, live Affliction as we speak currently, and then we will go into the PTR stuff at the end. Timestamps will be below, but in the meantime, let's get into it. Right, what you're looking on screen is the pure single target raid setup in terms of talents, making sure that you've got Shadow Embrace, Drain Soul at current Soul Tap, Pandemic Invocation, Creeping Death, Red Touch, Haunted Soul, Haunt, Tormented Crescendo, and Summon Dark Glare as a dot extension tool, with Siphon Life and Phantom Singularity both kind of going into these Dark Glare windows, with Dread Touch and Haunt just massively increasing your throughput for a period of time. Now, the reason this build it works the way it is essentially, it doesn't have anything flashy. Dark Glare itself isn't a particularly impressive cooldown, it never has been. The only time it becomes impressive is when you augment it with something like Grim Reach. This is because the amount of damage it does is actually really, really low by itself, and it is that pure dot extension tool that we're so used to. But for Affliction at the moment, that's actually a good thing, because with this build, we don't actually have anything flashy. We are almost the perfect level sustain type. We do have a few peaks and troughs, which will be when we get our dot extensions, we've got Dread Touches, and we can maintain that Dread Touch for the entire length of our Dark Glare when we've got the correct amount of shards. Because remember, what Dread Touch does is, if you've got your Malefic Affliction, so Malefic Rapture causes your active unstable affliction to deal 13% additional damage up to 39%, that's its third stack, for the rest of its duration. As long as you maintain unstable affliction once you've got those 3 stacks, it will stay at 3 stacks. Which then means that anytime you Malefic Rupture after that, you're going to end up increasing the damage of all your dots by 30% for 6 seconds. Pair that with the fact you've got Haunt on the target, which increases the damage that you deal to the target by 10% for 18 seconds. Then the fact that your Haunt spell also increases the damage of your damage over time effects by 20% while Haunt is active, you can kind of see how this gets into a situation where you're constantly throwing out this damage, especially when you have Shadow Embrace. You've got Soul Tap to give you a shard at the cost of 5% of your Soul Leech. For now, in 10.5 this will change. We actually get 2 different talents here. So Soul Tap is leaving us in 10.5 at the end of the month. And we'll discuss how that changes it when we actually get into the PTR. But this build essentially means that unused trinkets are kind of devalued. We can use them, and if we've got something like a Horn of Valor, which is a 2-minute int trinket, essentially, it goes really well with Dark Glare, as with something like a Racial Blood Fury, because it lines up with the dot extension windows, and you're making sure that you've got Dread Touch and Haunt, along with Siphon Life, Agony, Corruption, Phantom Singularity, extended throughout the entire duration of your Dark Glare and your Intellect buffs. So you will see a spike. But things like Rage Feather gain massive value because they're just passively constantly on the go. So Affliction's in a really interesting spot for a single target, but it's good. It's not as high as, say, Destruction or Demonology because of the fact that they have cooldowns and they have the ability to go and spike. Because at the moment, things like Mythic, for instance, really, really short fight. It's less than a 3-minute fight for some guilds now, which means it's massively burst focused, and Affliction isn't. But if you look at something like Mythic Teros, where the fight is high movement, it's a bit of a dance, you don't really have the correct players to drop 3-minute cooldowns. Instead, you have this build where every 2 minutes you have this little bit of a, right, dot extension, Malefic Rapture spam. So when the melee bait Teros, for instance, that's when you can Malefic Rapture spam. You can put 6 seconds of 30% additional dot damage on top of just clipping your Drain Soul to maintain the 9% buff, or debuff to the target. You've got your Haunt up that you need to refresh occasionally, and then the rest are all instant casts. Aside from your unstable Afflictions, of course. But you can kind of see what's happening, and with something like Tormented Crescendo, where Agony, Corruption, and Unstable Affliction are active, Shadowbolt has a 30% chance, or your Drain Soul a 20% chance, to make your next Malefic Rapture free. So you just get random procs of 6% additional dot damage, or 30% additional dot damage for 6 seconds. Pretty big. And consistent, which is where Affliction shines. So with that in mind, let's get into the AoE. Now, this build, on the other hand, is collectively probably one of, if not the most popular Affliction build that is currently out there. Still utilising Shadow Embrace, Drain Soul, Creeping Death for the faster Agony, Corruption, and Siphon Life ticks. You've got Soul Flame for the large AoE moments. You've got Sow the Seeds and Seed of Corruption, along with Grim Reach and Haunted Soul, because remember, Haunted Soul afflicts all damage over time effects on all targets. So Haunt essentially becomes a 20% AoE increase while it's out. Pair that with Grim Reach and the likes of Wrath of Consumption, Vile Taint, you've got a really solid build with some elements focused towards single target use as well. Now, there are a few ways you can deviate from this build slightly. First and foremost is changing Siphon Life to a C. Now, there's a debate to be made for this, whether or not having the 15% additional corruption damage and it not ticking out is actually worth against something like Siphon Life, because Siphon Life in an AoE setting, you're not going to bother applying, it's not worth it. But we have Seed of Corruption and Sow the Seeds to maintain corruption in large AoE packs. But Siphon Life then helps go towards the single target damage side of things. Now, this is kind of up to you and how you want to play. If you know realistically that you're going to be in a situation where you're going to Malefic Rapture on occasion, or your tanks are going to be pulling and stretching packs out as they kite, then maybe having Absolute Corruption is probably better, because there are going to be some stragglers that are missed by your Sow the Seeds and Seed of Corruption spams. Alternatively, if it's like a Tyrannical week and you want to play, then having Siphon Life paired with Haunted Soul, Creeping Death, and Wrath of Consumption for like ad-based boss fights, then go for it. Like, this build is probably really, really good for the likes of Temple of the Jade Serpent, because you've got Wrath of Consumption during Shower of Doubt, when you're dealing with the intermission phases, when you've got to deal with your remnants, or your shadowy replicas that will try and kill you. So you'll get to stack this back up to 5 stacks quite easily, with a good Seed of Corruption and maybe a VT, while also being close enough to the boss that you actually use VT to reapply Agony. And top it off, while at the same time making sure that Siphon Life, Corruption, UA are on your main target and are refreshed through the use of Haunt. So something like this is a fairly good build. But again, it's primarily a lot of passive damage. The only exception is when you get into the Summon Dark Glare moments. And Summoning Dark Glare in and of itself, not great. Paired with Grim Reach, however, it becomes an absolute powerhouse. because Dark Lair deals damage. It deals 50% of that damage to all enemies afflicted by your damage or would have effects. This basically means that your Dark Lair starts spreading things faster than you can. Quite literally. Grim Reach Dark Lair is responsible for those pulls that you'll see online, on my channel, elsewhere, where you're seeing like 400, 500, 800k Affliction Warlock pulls in places like Algathar Academy. The reason that's being done is because you can pull so many targets that between Grim Reach and Soulflame, you are doing millions of damage at the end of packs. And it's obscene. But there are few dungeons where this particular combination can truly shine. You really need a tank to understand how Affliction works to get the most out of it. Because if they understand that you have a 2-minute build where you can do obscene amounts of AoE, then hopefully they'll pull around that. Other dungeons where this can be used is Not Good Offensive. Not Good Offensive actually has a few interesting pack pulls that you can do if your tank knows you have this 2-minute build. But again, this is kind of a group by group thing. The same for some other dungeons where you could make an argument for it, but at the same time, places like maybe Halls of Valor on Tyrannical, where you need the likes of Herja, Heimdall, Fenrir to go down, Affliction's going to lose out a little bit there. That's where the likes of Destruction or Demonology take advantage. But that's all going to change. And with that, let's get onto the PTR. And we're on the PTR. Due to UI scaling differences between this and retail, I've obviously moved the camera, so I'm in a slightly different location. But with that, let's kind of get into it. Now, one interesting change with this is it actually allows us to independently change talents. So we can affect things, apply them, and it's going to be a nice kind of utility thing in the future. We don't have to allocate and reset all our points in order to lock in certain paths, or at least that's going to be a future change. So with the changes to talent, we're going to look at single target first, and then we're going to look at AoE. So if we remember, we're kind of looking at this, and then we hit, we'll Siphon Life, Phantom Singularity. We then had this to pick up, this to pick up. And now we hit the fact that Pandemic Invocation, which was here and was a 2-point talent, is now a 1-point talent. So Refreshing Corruption, Agony, Unstable Affliction, or Siphon Life with less than 5 seconds remaining will deal 4,673 shadow damage and has a 6.66% chance to grant you a Soul Shard. So it's basically just its empowered version that is now just a 1-rank talent, which is great. The second talent that we've got is actually part of Shadowlands' tier set returning, Focused Malignancy. Malefic Rapture deals 15% increased damage to targets suffering from unstable affliction, or 30% at 2 stacks. This is huge, and I will explain why in a moment. So, Creeping Death, Malefic Affliction, Dread Touch, and there. We are back to this. Now, we have both Focused Malignancy, Tormented Crescendo, and Malefic Affliction, all feeding into each other. So Malefic Rapture increases UA damage, and UA increases Malefic Rapture damage. Not only that, but we're also getting a buff as well. So this buff that we'll be getting, in terms of the amount of damage that Affliction does, is going to further add to this feedback loop. So this combination is huge. The fact that Pandemic Invocation is also receiving an even greater buff than what it's already had, because it did previously have a 500% buff. It is further getting buffed as well going into the PTR. So refreshing your dots is within 5 seconds remaining will deal nearly 5k shadow damage, which is bonkers when you consider just how often, as long as you don't have AC, you have to refresh all your dots. It's a huge amount of damage, and it's going to continue to be so. Paired with all of this. Now, the Summon Dark Lair thing doesn't really change a whole hell of a lot. It's still a dot extension. We're looking at increasing the damage we do, But because we have Focus Malignancy, Tormented Crescendo, and Malefic Affliction, it means that these buff windows that we're going to have for 2 minutes, with the likes of Horn of Valor again, 2-minute int trinket, is going to be even more prevalent, but not mandatory. We're still going to be able to make use of full passive trinkets. Alchemist Stones with its int procs, PvP trinkets, going to be able to use Rage Feather, or the passive trinkets from the raid, whatever you fancy. Even the likes of Eye of Scorvald and stuff like that, where they're passive trinket with an on-proc effect when you do damage. Those kind of things are still going to be Affliction's bread and butter. What the differences mean in terms of damage is, at the moment, at least on the PTR, it's looking like Affliction is actually going to outperform Demonology in terms of pure single target, which is bonkers. But funnily enough, the pathing doesn't change. The pathing, however, does start to change when we look at the AoE. So with that in mind, let's get into the AoE side of things. So, AoE, this is where we get into the meat and potatoes of the video. Because by meat and potato, there's a lot of different things we can do here, and a lot of different ways on how we can play this based on what our focus is. If we want to play some kind of hybridized AoE build, which, let's be fair, can be done, we can go back into this position. Like this, pick up Creeping Chaos. We can have something like this. And remember, Pandemic Invocation with Siphon Life, Creeping Death, things like this, this is going to be a relatively smooth build. Not a whole hell of a lot's going to have changed. Sorry, just put the Wrath of Consumption point there. The difference is, the way Pandemic Invocation is going to work in terms of its procs is, if you time these Seed of Corruptions right, your Seed of Corruptions are also going to mass apply Pandemic Invocation to shit. So you could have 10, 15 pack refresh essentially on your corruptions just as things are about to tick off. Because remember, Seed of Corruption, if you can get a Death Ball, you Seed of Corruption, you mass apply corruption at the same time to everything hit. Which means that by that very nature, you're then going to get a point within that pack where corruption's about to expire, and you're going to get a mass AoE proc of Pandemic Invocation. Big. And the differences, though, start getting into how we play around this and where we want to play around it. So what we can do is come out of Horned, and we can start playing Dark Harvest. Because, again, this is a minute build. Utilizes well with Sow the Seeds, especially when you consider the crit and haste benefited by Dark Harvest. Soul Eater's Gluttony, Affliction reduces the damage, or reduces the cooldown, sorry, of Soul Rot by 1 second every time it ticks. You've still got the Pandemic Invocation instant damage by refreshing things. And then you've got into Creeping Death, which, you know, not too shabby, and it ain't bad. Another build alternative would be this. Now, what you could do, hypothetically, is this particular build really dances on the edge of doing AoE and single target. This is utilizing the single target elements of Dread Touch paired with the AoE element of Grim Reach. This is kind of your halfway house, I want to be able to do everything in a dungeon situation, because you've got Focus Malignancy feeding into Malefic Affliction, and these two kind of feeding off each other with terms of your single target damage with Dread Touch, and then you've got your Dark Glare carrying you for the large AoE packs. So Priority Mob, great. AoE pack. Alternatively, what you can do is not bother, pick up Horned, and you still kind of have a similar thing where Horned is doing its single target priority damage, not as huge AoE, but still, it kind of feeds itself into a situation, which, when you start getting like your 2-target, 3-target cleave, this is going to be quite nice, this particular build, although I still personally am leaning in the direction of this as a setup when you consider that Siphon Life is going to help me feed into boss damage, and I'm going to actually be relying on staying away from AC for the Pandemic Invocation procs. If I want to run AC, what I'm going to have to do if I want to play with Creeping Death, is come out of Invocation, put 2 points there, and drop into something like this. But if this is a build I'm going to run, then realistically, I'm likely to then see a shift back into a more hybridized build that looks something like this. But realistically, from like a Mythic Plus setting and being like all-encompassing and all-damaging, having that 1 point in Invocation and having Siphon Life is gonna be the way to go. Because again, this is a build that we are already running and we are already familiar with in terms of its changes. But Soul Rot paired with Dark Harvest, because remember, Dark Harvest gives us haste and crit by the targets affected by Soul Rot. Which, when you consider that Pandemic Invocation may or may not be able to crit, Seed of Corruption certainly can crit, and Soul Flame can crit, you can kind of see where this mess goes into it. But I will leave these kind of debates up to you, because again, I can't 100% see the future. We've still got time for a couple of tuning changes, but hopefully you guys are going to enjoy this video, and hopefully you've enjoyed my attempt at future-proofing it. So with that in mind, I will hopefully see you all in the next one, folks, and I will catch you in the comparison guide. See you later. Just a post-edit thing, actually. You'll notice that in this guide I haven't done rotations for Affliction Warlock, and that goes back to what I was saying about Affliction Warlock not actually having cooldowns. We are a maintenance type class. We have our dots, our job is to maintain them. We obviously have a priority of making sure that Agony doesn't drop off, and Stable Affliction certainly doesn't drop off, especially when it's at 3 stacks of Malefic Affliction. And we then make sure the Corruption, Siphon Life, and Horned are also kept on the target at all times. Dropping off Shadow Embrace occasionally here and there isn't the be-all and end-all of the world, because again, thanks to Drain Soul, it stacks up quickly. And in an AoE setting, there's so many targets, but as long as you've got Agony out on 8 target, or up to 8 targets, and make sure the Corruption's out. Remember, we've got Vile Taint to mass apply these Agonies now, so getting it up to 8 targets isn't as detrimental or as difficult as it used to be. But we don't have a rotation, basically. We just have you got your dots up? Can you maintain them? So that kind of shaved a lot of time off the guide, hopefully. So yeah, hopefully you guys enjoyed the video, and I'll catch you all in the next one.